Richard Hale was a man who had everything money could buy, everything except the one thing he wanted most, an heir. At 51, he was still tall, sharp-suited, and commanding in presence, his salt-and-pepper hair adding to the aura of authority that made business rivals tremble. But wealth, status, and luxury had long since lost their novelty for him. When he gazed at the sprawling halls of his estate, the fine art covering its walls, or the rare wines locked away in his cellar, he felt only hollowness. What haunted him most was the ticking of time, the undeniable reminder that his legacy would die with him unless he had a child to inherit it. Richard's arrogance kept him from admitting weakness. He told himself it wasn't sentiment that drove him, only practicality. His millions, his empire, his name, it all had to go somewhere. And yet, behind that cold reasoning, lay a gnawing loneliness that grew deeper with every passing year. One bitterly cold evening in the city, Richard's chauffeur stopped at a red light. From the tinted window of his limousine, Richard's gaze fell upon a cluster of people huddled near a shelter entrance. Among them, one woman stood apart. She wasn't begging like the others. She wasn't holding a cardboard sign. She simply sat on the steps, a blanket wrapped tightly around her, her eyes fixed on the distant skyline. Her face was tired, streaked with the marks of hardship, yet her posture carried a quiet resilience. Richard studied her. Something about her refusal to appear broken fascinated him. He ordered the chauffeur to stop a little ahead. Stepping out of his car into the cold air, Richard approached her, drawing suspicious glances from the others nearby. The woman lifted her head. Her eyes, clear, sharp, and tinged with wariness, met his. "Do you need something?" she asked, her voice steady despite the shivers in her body. "What's your name?" Richard countered. "Clara," she said cautiously. He introduced himself simply as Richard. He didn't need to say his last name, anyone who read the business pages knew it. Still, Clara's expression didn't change. She didn't look impressed. That alone unsettled him. They spoke briefly. Richard asked about her situation, and Clara reluctantly admitted she had been in and out of shelters for nearly 2 years, ever since a medical debt and a lost job had unraveled her life. She had no family left, no support, and she was tired of surviving on scraps. Richard felt something stir, a thought bold and unorthodox. Most men of his standing would never say aloud what crossed his mind, but Richard was not like most men. He believed money was the answer to everything. Why pretend otherwise? "I have a proposition for you," he said. Clara narrowed her eyes. "What kind of proposition?" Richard spoke with the same tone he used in boardrooms, cold and deliberate. "I need an heir. I want a child, someone to inherit everything I've built. You could give me that." Clara froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. He continued before she could respond. "In exchange, I'll give you a home. Not just shelter, a house, fully furnished. I'll ensure you have the best medical care throughout the pregnancy. You'll never go hungry again. And, of course, a generous sum of money. Enough to secure your future." The audacity of the offer left Clara speechless. It sounded more like a business contract than a human arrangement. "You want me to have your child? For money," she said slowly. Richard didn't flinch. "Yes. You'll be compensated well. Think of it as an agreement. I get what I want, and you get a new life." Clara's first instinct was anger. She wasn't some object to be bought, some vessel to fulfill his vanity. But then, as the icy wind cut deeper into her skin and her empty stomach growled, the reality of her situation pressed hard against her pride. Nights in the shelter. Days scrounging for work that never came. The cold truth was that survival didn't always leave room for dignity. Her mind raced. Could she really do this? Carry a stranger's child for money? She imagined herself in a warm bed, with food, with safety. She imagined not having to fight every single day just to survive. A house. Security. A chance at rebuilding her life. Richard watched her carefully. He could see the conflict in her face. Inwardly, he was confident she would say yes. Everyone had a price, and he had more than enough money to cover it. Finally, Clara's voice broke the silence. "I'll do it," she whispered, though her tone carried both resignation and determination. Richard allowed himself a thin smile. "Good. Then it's settled." But as Clara lowered her gaze, clutching her blanket tighter, she silently vowed that this decision would not define her. She would not be bought so easily. If she was to carry this child, it would not be just Richard's heir. It would be hers too, her blood, her flesh, her chance at redemption. And in that moment, though Richard didn't realize it, his neat little arrangement had already begun to unravel. He believed everything could be controlled, everything could be purchased. What he didn't see was the quiet strength in Clara's eyes, or the destiny waiting in the life they were at. First night Clara spent in Richard Hale's mansion felt unreal. The bed was larger than the entire cot she had shared with 3 other women at the shelter. The sheets were soft, the pillows smelled faintly of lavender, and the silence was so thick it pressed against her ears. She had never known such comfort, yet as she lay staring at the ornate ceiling, she felt like a guest in a museum rather than someone at home. Richard had not welcomed her warmly. He had simply given her a tour, introduced her briefly to the staff, and then handed her a folder of rules typed neatly by his assistant. Inside were pages of dietary restrictions, daily schedules, approved activities, and emergency protocols. Clara couldn't decide if it was impressive or insulting. "This is not a vacation," Richard had told her as he closed the folder. "You are here to fulfill a purpose. Comfort has been provided, but there will be structure. No smoking, no alcohol, no junk food. You will attend every doctor's appointment arranged by my physician. You'll be monitored carefully. If you require anything, it will go through my staff." Clara had nodded silently, though the words stung. A part of her wanted to shout at him that she wasn't livestock or machinery. But she bit her tongue. Pride didn't put food on the table. Pride didn't keep you warm at night. In the following weeks, Clara adjusted, at least on the surface. She ate meals prepared by chefs, meals she had never dreamed of tasting before. Yet there was no joy in them, not when each bite was weighed, measured, and scrutinized according to Richard's rules. The staff were polite, but their politeness was cold, distant. Some whispered behind her back when they thought she couldn't hear. She wasn't like them, and they knew it. To them, she was an outsider, a scandal waiting to happen. One morning, as Clara left the doctor's office, she noticed a man with a camera lurking near the car. The chauffeur hurried her inside before more could happen, but the incident left Clara shaken. "What if people find out?" she asked Richard later that evening, clutching her cup of herbal tea. Richard didn't look up from the papers on his desk. "Let them. Rumors are inevitable. They will fade once the child is born. What matters is discretion now. Don't speak to reporters, don't leave without informing my staff. Everything is manageable if you follow instructions." Clara wanted to ask, "And what about me? What about my dignity?" But she knew better. To Richard, she was a transaction, an arrangement, a body carrying his heir. Still, Clara couldn't silence the storm inside her. At night, when she lay alone in that enormous bed, she pressed her hands against her stomach. The child wasn't even visible yet, but she felt its presence. A life forming inside her, a life that was hers as much as his. With every passing day, she thought less of Richard's money and more of the future she might give her baby. Could she raise it here, in this mansion full of rules and coldness? Or would she always be treated as nothing more than the woman who had carried Richard Hale's heir? Her guilt gnawed at her too. Was she selfish for agreeing to this? Had she betrayed herself by taking his money in exchange for something so sacred? Yet every time she thought of her nights on the shelter floor, of the hunger that used to twist her stomach, she reminded herself that survival wasn't betrayal. It was necessity. Richard remained distant. He kept to his office, his business meetings, his endless phone calls. Sometimes, he joined her at dinner, but those evenings were no warmer than the empty ones. He asked about the pregnancy, about the doctor's reports, about whether she had followed the diet. Never once did he ask how she felt. One night, Clara gathered courage. "Why me?" she asked softly across the dinner table. Richard looked up, almost irritated by the question. "You were there," he said simply. "You had nothing to lose, and I had everything to gain. It was efficient." The words cut deeper than Clara expected. She had known this was an arrangement, yet hearing it said so bluntly left her hollow. She excused herself early that evening, returning to her room with tears she refused to shed in front of anyone else. Still, beneath the hurt, something flickered inside her: determination. If Richard saw her as nothing more than a means to an end, then she would prove him wrong. She wasn't just a transaction. She wasn't disposable. And her child would never be treated as one. As the weeks turned into months, Clara began to hold on to that thought. Her body changed, her stomach grew, her energy waned, but her resolve hardened. She followed Richard's rules for now, ate the foods, attended the appointments, played her part. But inside, she was making her own plans. For all Richard's wealth and power, there was one thing he couldn't control: the bond between a mother and her child. Clara held her stomach, whispering promises to the tiny heartbeat within her. No matter what Richard believed, this child would not belong to him alone. In that cold, cavernous mansion, where every surface gleamed with wealth but lacked warmth, Clara began to discover a quiet strength. A strength that Richard underestimated. And though the future terrified her, she knew one thing with certainty: she was no longer just surviving. She was preparing, for motherhood, for battle, for whatever came next. About to create. The first night Clara spent in Richard Hale's mansion felt unreal. The bed was larger than the entire cot she had shared with 3 other women at the shelter. The sheets were soft, the pillows smelled faintly of lavender, and the silence was so thick it pressed against her ears. She had never known such comfort, yet as she lay staring at the ornate ceiling, she felt like a guest in a museum rather than someone at home. Richard had not welcomed her warmly. He had simply given her a tour, introduced her briefly to the staff, and then handed her a folder of rules typed neatly by his assistant. Inside were pages of dietary restrictions, daily schedules, approved activities, and emergency protocols. Clara couldn't decide if it was impressive or insulting. "This is not a vacation," Richard had told her as he closed the folder. "You are here to fulfill a purpose. Comfort has been provided, but there will be structure. No smoking, no alcohol, no junk food. You will attend every doctor's appointment arranged by my physician. You'll be monitored carefully. If you require anything, it will go through my staff." Clara had nodded silently, though the words stung. A part of her wanted to shout at him that she wasn't livestock or machinery. But she bit her tongue. Pride didn't put food on the table. Pride didn't keep you warm at night. In the following weeks, Clara adjusted, at least on the surface. She ate meals prepared by chefs, meals she had never dreamed of tasting before. Yet there was no joy in them, not when each bite was weighed, measured, and scrutinized according to Richard's rules. The staff were polite, but their politeness was cold, distant. Some whispered behind her back when they thought she couldn't hear. She wasn't like them, and they knew it. To them, she was an outsider, a scandal waiting to happen. One morning, as Clara left the doctor's office, she noticed a man with a camera lurking near the car. The chauffeur hurried her inside before more could happen, but the incident left Clara shaken. "What if people find out?" she asked Richard later that evening, clutching her cup of herbal tea. Richard didn't look up from the papers on his desk. "Let them. Rumors are inevitable. They will fade once the child is born. What matters is discretion now. Don't speak to reporters, don't leave without informing my staff. Everything is manageable if you follow instructions." Clara wanted to ask, "And what about me? What about my dignity?" But she knew better. To Richard, she was a transaction, an arrangement, a body carrying his heir. Still, Clara couldn't silence the storm inside her. At night, when she lay alone in that enormous bed, she pressed her hands against her stomach. The child wasn't even visible yet, but she felt its presence. A life forming inside her, a life that was hers as much as his. With every passing day, she thought less of Richard's money and more of the future she might give her baby. Could she raise it here, in this mansion full of rules and coldness? Or would she always be treated as nothing more than the woman who had carried Richard Hale's heir? Her guilt gnawed at her too. Was she selfish for agreeing to this? Had she betrayed herself by taking his money in exchange for something so sacred? Yet every time she thought of her nights on the shelter floor, of the hunger that used to twist her stomach, she reminded herself that survival wasn't betrayal. It was necessity. Richard remained distant. He kept to his office, his business meetings, his endless phone calls. Sometimes, he joined her at dinner, but those evenings were no warmer than the empty ones. He asked about the pregnancy, about the doctor's reports, about whether she had followed the diet. Never once did he ask how she felt. One night, Clara gathered courage. "Why me?" she asked softly across the dinner table. Richard looked up, almost irritated by the question. "You were there," he said simply. "You had nothing to lose, and I had everything to gain. It was efficient." The words cut deeper than Clara expected. She had known this was an arrangement, yet hearing it said so bluntly left her hollow. She excused herself early that evening, returning to her room with tears she refused to shed in front of anyone else. Still, beneath the hurt, something flickered inside her: determination. If Richard saw her as nothing more than a means to an end, then she would prove him wrong. She wasn't just a transaction. She wasn't disposable. And her child would never be treated as one. As the weeks turned into months, Clara began to hold on to that thought. Her body changed, her stomach grew, her energy waned, but her resolve hardened. She followed Richard's rules for now, ate the foods, attended the appointments, played her part. But inside, she was making her own plans. For all Richard's wealth and power, there was one thing he couldn't control: the bond between a mother and her child. Clara held her stomach, whispering promises to the tiny heartbeat within her. No matter what Richard believed, this child would not belong to him alone. In that cold, cavernous mansion, where every surface gleamed with wealth but lacked warmth, Clara began to discover a quiet strength. A strength that Richard underestimated. And though the future terrified her, she knew one thing with certainty: she was no longer just surviving. She was preparing, for motherhood, for battle, for whatever came next. The days in Richard Hale's mansion followed a strict rhythm: meals at set hours, doctor's appointments on his schedule, and Clara's every move shadowed by quiet, watchful staff. Yet amidst the rigidity, something unexpected began to unfold: tiny cracks in Richard's cold exterior, glimpses of a man who wasn't made only of arrogance and wealth. It began one rainy afternoon. Clara sat in the sunroom, staring out at the gardens blurred by the downpour. She had been flipping through a book, but her mind wandered back to memories she usually kept buried. She didn't notice Richard enter until he spoke. "You read?" His voice held a note of surprise, as though literacy in her seemed unlikely. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, I read. I wasn't always," she hesitated, the word homeless sticking in her throat. "This way." Richard sat across from her, curious despite himself. "What do you mean?" For a moment, Clara considered retreating into silence. But something in his tone, less commanding, more human, made her continue. "I went to college. Literature. I wanted to teach. My life was normal, once. Until the accident." He tilted his head, studying her as though she were a puzzle. "What accident?" Clara's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "A car crash. My parents were killed instantly. My brother, he lingered for a few months. I spent everything I had on his hospital bills. When he died, I had nothing left. No family, no money. Just debt. One step at a time, I fell apart. First my apartment, then my job, and then the street." Silence settled between them, broken only by the drumming of rain. Richard's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. He didn't offer condolences. Richard Hale wasn't the type for words of comfort, but for the first time, Clara felt seen. "You adapted," he said finally. "Most people wouldn't have survived that." Clara blinked, surprised by the hint of respect in his voice. "Survival isn't the same as living," she murmured. Something flickered across his face then, something almost like agreement. He quickly looked away, masking it behind his usual indifference. But Clara noticed. For a brief second, the millionaire seemed human. Over the following weeks, those moments repeated in small, unexpected ways. Once, Clara dropped a teacup, and instead of snapping at her, Richard bent to pick up the pieces himself. Another evening, he noticed her struggling to reach a book on a high shelf and retrieved it without a word, handing it to her like a gentleman of a bygone era. These gestures were fleeting, but they unsettled Clara, leaving her wondering, who was the man behind the money, behind the armor of control? One night after dinner, Clara lingered in the library, her hand resting on her growing belly. She spoke softly to the child, words of comfort and dreams of the future. "You're not alone, little one. I'm here. I'll always be here. She hadn't realized Richard was standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. What are you doing? Clara startled, then turned to him. Talking to my baby. Richard's brow furrowed. It's not a baby yet. He paused, searching for the word. An heir. A legacy. An asset. Clara stiffened. No, she said firmly. It's a child. My child. A life. You can call it what you want, but to me, it's more than business. For once, Richard had no immediate reply. He looked at her, at the way her hand protected her stomach, at the tenderness in her eyes. Something in that sight disturbed him. He muttered something under his breath and turned sharply away. But later that night, Clara thought she heard footsteps outside her room, soft, hesitant, almost as if Richard had lingered near her door. She didn't open it. She simply lay in bed, wondering if the man who saw the child as a contract also wrestled with emotions he refused to admit. Days bled into weeks, and Clara noticed how their conversations shifted. Richard asked about her past, about books she liked, about her thoughts on certain news articles. His questions were clipped, almost reluctant, but they were questions nonetheless. Clara answered honestly, and in doing so, she found herself seeing Richard differently too. Beneath his arrogance, she glimpsed a man shaped by isolation. A man who lived surrounded by wealth yet seemed starved of intimacy. She wondered if his obsession with control came from fear of being vulnerable, of being hurt, of losing something he couldn't replace with money. One afternoon, as Clara recited poetry aloud in the garden, Richard stood a few steps behind, listening. His face betrayed no expression, but his stillness said enough. Clara realized he wasn't immune to beauty, he simply didn't know how to respond to it. For all their differences, something subtle and fragile began to grow between them, not affection, not yet trust, but recognition. He began to see her not only as the homeless woman he had paid, but as a person. And she, against her will, began to sense the humanity buried under his polished, impenetrable exterior. Yet for every step forward, there was resistance. When Clara mentioned feeling the baby's first flutters, Richard looked away, muttering, "Don't get too attached." When she placed his hand on her stomach, urging him to feel the movement, he withdrew quickly, as if burned. "It's not a game," he warned. "Don't forget why you're here." Clara held his gaze, unflinching. "And don't forget this child isn't just yours. It's ours. And it's alive." The silence that followed was heavy, but beneath it, Clara sensed an invisible war being waged inside him. For Richard, the unborn child was security, legacy, insurance against a future alone. For Clara, it was hope, redemption, a piece of love she thought she'd lost forever. The clash of those beliefs hung between them, unresolved. Yet the glimpses of humanity, their shared conversations, their fleeting compassion, hinted at something that neither of them dared name. For now, Clara clung to the bond with her unborn child, whispering promises into the silence. Richard watched from the shadows, unsettled by what he saw, not weakness, but strength. A strength he hadn't accounted for. A strength that, one day, might upend everything he thought he could control. Clara sat at the long mahogany dining table, the silverware polished so brightly that her reflection stared back at her with weary eyes. Richard dined opposite her, reading over a set of contracts while the untouched roast on his plate grew cold. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "I want more than this." Richard looked up, his brow arched. "More than what?" "This life. These rules. The way you've bought my silence, my body, my future." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it with resolve. "I want dignity, not just money." Richard set the papers down slowly, his expression unreadable. "You have a roof over your head, food on the table, the best doctor's money can buy. That's more than you had before." Clara met his gaze, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. "That's survival, Richard. It's not respect." For once, Richard didn't snap back. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, as though assessing a new business deal. Clara's words had struck something he didn't want to name. Whispers of scandal. A few days later, the cracks in his perfect control widened. At a charity gala, Richard stood surrounded by his usual circle of polished rivals and shallow acquaintances. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter swirled, but beneath it ran a vein of mockery. "So, Richard," one man drawled, his smile edged with malice, "we hear you've taken an unconventional approach to fatherhood." Another snickered. "Buying an heir, were you? Very efficient. No messy marriages, no inconvenient attachments." The group chuckled, and Richard's jaw tightened. He raised his glass smoothly, pretending indifference, but their words burrowed under his skin. His empire was built on control, on being untouchable. Now whispers of his private arrangement threatened to reduce him to ridicule. Clara had not been invited, of course, but Richard's mind flickered to her face, the way she held her chin high when she demanded dignity, the quiet fire in her eyes when she spoke of the baby as life, not legacy. He had thought of her as a contract. But the world saw her as proof of his weakness. And that burned. Clara's dreams. Back at the mansion, Clara sat by the nursery Richard had begun to prepare, a sterile, expensive room filled with designer furniture, more showroom than sanctuary. She ran her hands over the crib's smooth frame and whispered to the unborn child, "You deserve more than this. More than being a pawn in his empire. You deserve freedom. Love. A life that isn't measured in contracts." She closed her eyes, imagining a small cottage somewhere far from the city. A garden. Laughter. A child who belonged to no one's empire but their own small world. It was dangerous to dream, dreams could be crushed, but Clara clung to them anyway. They were her rebellion, her secret strength. Richard's conflict. When Richard returned from the gala, his composure was brittle. He found Clara in the library, reading aloud softly to herself. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "They mock me," he said abruptly. Clara looked up, startled. "What?" "My rivals. They laugh behind my back. They say I've bought an heir." His voice was sharp, but beneath it lay something else, shame. Clara closed the book carefully. "Because you have," she said softly. His eyes narrowed, but she didn't flinch. "You think I don't know." Clara continued. "You wanted control, so you found someone you thought was powerless. But you can't buy respect, Richard. Not from them. Not from me." For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice quieter than she had ever heard, he admitted, "I didn't expect you to fight me." Clara's lips curved in a sad smile. "That's because you've only ever dealt with people who want your money. I don't. I want my child to have a future beyond your control." Richard's jaw worked, but the harsh retort never came. Instead, he turned away, pacing the length of the library. His thoughts churned. He had built his empire on control, on bending others to his will. Yet this woman, with nothing but her stubborn dignity, unsettled him. She wasn't supposed to matter. And yet, she did. The cracks widen. In the days that followed, Richard became unpredictable. At times, he was harsher than ever, retreating into commands and contracts as if to remind himself of the rules. Other times, he faltered, pausing too long when Clara laughed softly to herself, or when she hummed to the unborn child. He told himself it was irritation, nothing more. But when Clara smiled faintly at her growing belly, he felt something twist in his chest. At night, Richard stared out his window at the glittering skyline, unease gnawing at him. For years, control had been his religion, money his shield. Now Clara's presence cracked both. And the deeper truth frightened him. For the first time, he wondered if control was slipping not because she fought him, but because a part of him wanted to let it slip. Clara sat curled on the edge of the bed, her hands pressed to her swollen belly as another wave of nausea gripped her. The morning sickness had grown worse instead of better, and though the doctors assured her it wasn't uncommon, the loneliness gnawed at her more than the pain. The mansion was silent, cavernous, and cold. The staff moved like ghosts, present but distant, their eyes filled with polite disdain. Clara could feel their judgment in the way they handed her meals or watched her like she was a strange intruder. She told herself she didn't care. But in the long nights when sleep refused to come, she would press a pillow against her face to muffle her sobs. Her body was changing in ways she hadn't expected, aches in her back, swelling in her ankles, a heaviness in her chest when she tried to breathe. And though she tried to stay strong, cracks of fear seeped through. What if something happened to the baby? What if she failed at the only role Richard truly wanted from her? The scare. It was late afternoon when the sharp pain hit. It was unlike the dull aches she'd endured before, a stabbing, twisting pain that left her gasping. Panic surged through her as she stumbled toward the phone, clutching her stomach. Within minutes, the driver was rushing her to the hospital. Clara sat hunched in the back seat, beads of sweat gathering on her forehead, whispering prayers into the silence. She had no one to call. No family. No friend. Only Richard, and she couldn't imagine he would leave his empire for her. When the hospital doors slid open, Clara was swallowed by white walls and harsh lights. Nurses rushed her onto a bed, voices brisk and professional. Blood pressure checks. Ultrasound. Questions she barely processed. Fear blurred everything into a haze. And then she heard his voice. "Where is she?" Richard Hale, immaculate in a tailored suit, strode through the ward with an expression that silenced even the nurses. His gaze swept the room until it landed on Clara, and for the first time since she had known him, the mask cracked. His face was pale, his jaw tight, not with arrogance, but with worry. He moved to her bedside, gripping the rail. "Clara, what happened?" Her lips trembled. I don't know. The baby, something's wrong." His hand hovered, then settled awkwardly but firmly over hers. It wasn't rehearsed or calculated, it was instinct. And for the first time, she saw not a man of stone, but a man terrified of losing what he couldn't replace. The waiting. Hours passed in a blur of tests and reassurances. The doctors finally explained it was a complication, serious, but manageable with rest and care. Clara's body was under stress, but the baby's heartbeat was strong. When the doctors left, Clara sagged in relief, tears slipping down her cheeks. Richard remained at her side, his hand never leaving hers. "You scared me," he muttered, his voice low and rough. Clara blinked at him through tears. "You came." "Of course I came." He hesitated, then admitted, "I thought I was going to lose everything." "Everything," she whispered, part of her bristling. Was that all the baby was to him, an heir, a legacy? But then she looked closer. His grip was too tight, his eyes too raw. This wasn't the arrogance of a man afraid of scandal. This was the desperation of someone terrified of abandonment. "You've lost before," Clara said softly, more a statement than a question. Richard froze, as if she had peeled back armor he hadn't meant to expose. His jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. A glimpse of truth. Over the next few days, Richard stayed. He brought his laptop, holding conference calls from a stiff hospital chair, but he never left Clara's side for long. Nurses whispered in surprise, Richard Hale, the untouchable billionaire, sitting for hours by a woman who wasn't his wife. Clara caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was asleep. Not with cold calculation, but with something almost human. Vulnerable. On the third night, Clara shifted uncomfortably on the bed. "You don't have to stay," she murmured. "I'll be fine." Richard's gaze flicked to her, sharp and defensive. "You think I'm here for you?" She tilted her head, tired but amused. "Aren't you?" For once, Richard didn't have a quick retort. His shoulders sagged, and after a long silence, he said, "I don't want to be left alone again." The words startled her. They were unguarded, almost childlike. Clara realized then that beneath the arrogance and control, Richard was a man haunted by shadows, fear of betrayal, fear of emptiness, fear that all his money could not shield him from being abandoned. She softened. "This child isn't leaving you," she said gently, pressing his hand to her belly. "Not if I can help it." For a moment, his eyes softened too, his fingers trembling slightly against the rhythm of life within her. Fragile respect. When Clara was finally discharged, Richard personally escorted her back to the mansion. The ride was quiet, but not with hostility. It was the silence of two people who had glimpsed something raw and uncertain in each other. At the door, Clara paused. "Thank you for being there." Richard inclined his head stiffly, as if gratitude embarrassed him. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, respect. Their arrangement hadn't changed on paper. She was still the woman carrying his heir, he was still the man who had paid for her womb. Yet something deeper had begun to grow. Not love, not yet. But a fragile bond, born of fear, pain, and the undeniable humanity of shared vulnerability. Clara placed a hand over her stomach and whispered to the child later that night. He's not the man he pretends to be. There's more to him. Maybe we'll find it together. Richard, alone in his study, poured himself a glass of whiskey. He stared into the amber liquid, haunted by the memory of Clara's tears, her whispered courage, the way she had seen through him without effort. For the first time in years, he wondered if control wasn't the answer. If maybe, just maybe, what he really feared was not losing power, but losing the chance to belong. The days after Clara's hospital scare passed with an uneasy calm. Richard had shown a side of himself she hadn't expected, protective, even vulnerable, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to believe things might change. That perhaps she wasn't just a vessel carrying his air, but a person who mattered. But calm never lasted long in Richard Hale's world. Madeline's return. It began with the sound of laughter drifting through the halls of the mansion. A sharp, tinkling laugh, dripping with cruelty. Clara froze when she heard it, every instinct warning her that something poisonous had seeped into her fragile space. Later, as she descended the staircase carefully, hand on the railing to support her swollen belly, she saw her. Madeline Pierce. Tall, elegant, wrapped in a crimson dress that clung to her like fire, Madeline stood in Richard's study as though she had never left. Her blonde hair gleamed under the chandelier, and her red lips curved into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Well," Madeline drawled, her eyes sweeping Clara from head to toe. "So this is the famous replacement. A charity case with a bump." Clara stiffened. Before she could retreat, Richard entered the room, his expression unreadable. "Madeline, this isn't a good time." "Not a good time." She turned to him with mock hurt. "After everything I was to you, Richard, you toss me aside for this." Her manicured nails pointed toward Clara, her words venomous. "A homeless woman off the street? Is that what your empire has come to?" Clara's heart pounded, but she said nothing. She had no weapons against a woman like Madeline, polished, confident, and cruel. Richard's silence hurt more than Madeline's insults. He didn't correct her. He didn't defend Clara. Rumors in the shadows. Within days of Madeline's reappearance, whispers began to spread. Clara caught fragments when the staff thought she wasn't listening. "They say she's unstable. She used to sleep in shelters. Can a woman like that raise a child fit for the Hale legacy?" Madeline had a talent for weaving poison into silk. She visited often, her laughter echoing through the halls as she lingered too close to Richard, reminding everyone of her old place in his life. And she never missed a chance to remind Clara of hers. One afternoon, Clara overheard Madeline's voice as she approached the study door. "Richard, you can't possibly think she's capable. She'll ruin everything. Look at her, she's fragile, she's pathetic. She can't even handle a pregnancy without collapsing in hospitals." Clara pressed her back against the wall, breath shallow. "She's carrying my child," Richard said, his voice clipped. "Your child, yes. But children need mothers who are strong, who know how to stand in society, who can give them a legacy. She's beneath you." Madeline's voice softened, a predator's purr. "You and I both know it." There was silence. Clara's heart raced as she strained to hear his answer. Finally, Richard spoke. "It's not that simple. Not denial. Not defense. Just weary hesitation." The words cut deeper than any outright insult. Clara turned away, tears blurring her vision. The man who had held her hand in the hospital, who had shown her a flicker of humanity, was now letting another woman carve her into pieces. Fractured trust. The mansion no longer felt like a place of refuge. It became a gilded cage filled with whispers and mocking smiles. Madeline took every opportunity to accidentally cross Clara's path, her words dripping venom. "Poor dear," she cooed one morning as Clara sat in the sunroom. "Do you know what happens when men grow bored? They remember who was really meant to stand beside them." Clara stared down at her tea, refusing to engage, but her silence only made Madeline smirk. At night, Clara lay awake, her hand on her belly. She thought of the child growing inside her, of the bond she had begun to feel with Richard, and how easily it seemed to fracture under Madeline's presence. Doubt gnawed at her, doubt in herself, in Richard, in the fragile hope she had dared to nurture. One evening, she found herself packing a small bag. Just the essentials, a few clothes, the little savings she had hidden away, and a baby blanket she had bought secretly in town. Her hands trembled as she folded the items. Running. It was the instinct of survival. She had lived her life moving from place to place, never wanted, never rooted. Perhaps she could disappear again, raise the baby somewhere no one knew the name Richard Hale. But as she zipped the bag, her body twisted with another sharp cramp. She sank onto the bed, clutching her belly. The reminder was brutal. Her baby needed stability, safety, medical care. She couldn't vanish into shelters and streets again. Not now. She pressed the blanket to her face, sobbing quietly. "I'll stay. For you," she whispered to the child within her. But not for him. Never again for him. Richard's blindness. Richard, for his part, seemed trapped in old patterns. He tolerated Madeline's presence, even entertained her suggestions at times, though his expression was always conflicted. Clara began to realize he was a man haunted not only by loss but by habit. Madeline represented a world he understood: manipulation, power, image. Clara represented everything he feared: vulnerability, unpredictability, truth. Yet he didn't see how each silence, each hesitation, was driving Clara further from him. Clara withdrew into herself, her conversations with him reduced to politeness. He noticed, she caught him watching her sometimes, as though he wanted to ask what was wrong. But he never did. Pride, fear, or perhaps cowardice sealed his lips. And so the distance grew, an invisible canyon between them. The choice to stay. By the end of the month, Clara's decision was made. She would stay in the mansion, endure Madeline's venom and Richard's silence, but only until the baby was born. After that, she would take what was rightfully her child's and carve a life elsewhere, far from manipulations, far from betrayals. She placed her hand on her stomach once more, whispering as if the baby could understand. "We'll survive this. And when you're here, you'll never doubt that you were wanted. Even if I have to fight the world alone." Outside her door, the echo of Madeline's laughter carried through the hall once again. Clara closed her eyes, steadying her breath. The shadows of betrayal pressed in around her, but she clung to the only light she had left, her child. The night Clara went into labor was unlike any other, wild, merciless, and unforgiving. Rain battered the sprawling glass windows of Richard Hale's mansion as wind howled through the trees, bending them dangerously close to snapping. The storm arrived as if summoned by fate, echoing the chaos about to unfold inside the walls of the estate. Clara had felt the first pains earlier that afternoon, a dull ache that slowly sharpened into waves of agony. At first, she tried to remain calm, pacing the elegant yet sterile guest wing where she had been confined for months. The marble floors, the velvet drapes, and the scent of polished wood seemed suffocating now. She pressed her palms against her belly, whispering to the child she had spoken to since the earliest days, "We'll get through this. I promise." But the storm worsened, and so did her pain. The staff, trained more in formality than emergency, panicked. The roads were quickly flooding, ambulances delayed. Clara realized with growing dread that Richard, who had been away at a last-minute business dinner despite the weather warnings, might not make it in time. The thought of giving birth without him, without the man who had orchestrated this life yet was slowly becoming part of it, left her shaken. Richard's race against the storm. Meanwhile, Richard sat trapped in the back of his sleek black car, frustration burning in his chest as his driver struggled through the torrential downpour. His phone buzzed relentlessly, first from the staff, then from the hospital on standby, and finally from Clara herself. Her voice, raw with pain, cut through his arrogance like a blade. "If you don't make it, if you leave me to do this alone, Richard, then you'll never know what kind of man you really are." Those words haunted him as rain lashed against the windshield. For the first time in years, Richard felt helpless. His empire, his wealth, his control, none of it mattered if he wasn't there when it truly counted. By the time he reached the mansion, drenched and frantic, he was no longer the unflappable tycoon but a man terrified of losing something he hadn't yet understood he needed. The labor. Clara was already in agony when Richard burst into the room. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, her breath sharp and uneven. Nurses rushed around, preparing what they could in the makeshift birthing setup. The hospital team was delayed, but there was no waiting, the baby was coming now. When Richard entered, she glared at him through tears, a mix of fury and relief. "You're late," she rasped, her hands gripping the sheets so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I'm here now," Richard whispered, his voice cracking in a way neither of them expected. He rushed to her side, his hand hovering awkwardly before she seized it in desperation. The hours blurred into primal pain and raw emotion. Clara screamed, cried, and pushed while Richard, for once, was utterly powerless. He whispered clumsy reassurances, his voice breaking with every cry she made. The storm outside raged as if echoing her suffering, thunder shaking the very walls. At one point, Clara nearly collapsed from exhaustion, her strength fading. Panic seized Richard as machines beeped erratically and nurses shouted instructions. He bent down close, his forehead nearly touching hers, his voice trembling. "Don't give up. Please. Clara, don't leave me. Don't leave us." It was the first time he'd admitted the fear he had long buried, the terror of loss, of emptiness, of a life without family. His confession, whispered in the chaos, gave Clara the strength she needed. With a final, desperate push, the child entered the world. The first cry. The sound pierced the storm like sunlight through clouds, the baby's first cry. Raw, powerful, and full of life, it silenced the room. Clara collapsed back on the pillows, tears streaking her face, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The nurses worked quickly, wrapping the tiny infant in a soft blanket, placing the child gently in Clara's trembling arms. Richard stood frozen, his eyes wide, his breath stolen. He had imagined this moment as a business transaction fulfilled, an objective completed. But when he saw Clara cradling the baby, her lips brushing its forehead as tears of pure joy spilled down her cheeks, something inside him cracked wide open. He sank to the edge of the bed, unable to look away. For the first time, Richard Hale saw not an heir, not an investment, but his child. A fragile, perfect being who carried with them a truth far larger than money or legacy. The shocking revelation. And then came the silence. As Clara carefully unwrapped the blanket, Richard's gaze fell on the infant's tiny face. His chest constricted. The baby was healthy, beautiful, but the features were undeniable. A strong jawline. Sharp cheekbones. The same piercing blue eyes Richard had seen every day in the family portraits that lined his estate. But not his own. No, those eyes, that face, it belonged to someone else. Someone Richard had buried long ago. His late brother, Jonathan Hale. Richard stumbled back as if struck. His mind reeled, memories flooding, the laughter of his brother, their bitter arguments, the tragedy of Jonathan's sudden death. And now, before him, in the fragile form of a newborn, was his brother reborn. Richard. Clara's voice was soft, weary, but worried. "What's wrong?" He couldn't answer. His mouth opened, but no words came. He stared at the child, then at Clara, suspicion and fear swirling in his chest. The storm outside thundered again, shaking the house as though nature itself bore witness to the revelation. Richard's thoughts raced. Was this fate? A cruel trick? Or a secret Clara had kept from him? But deep down, another, darker thought gnawed at him, the one he dared not say aloud. Was his brother ever truly gone? Clara's peace. Clara, unaware of the turmoil in Richard's mind, gazed at the child with peace. She kissed the baby's forehead, whispering softly, "You're everything I hoped for. You're the reason I survived." For her, there was no shock, no scandal, only love. But for Richard, the birth of his child had become a haunting question, one that threatened everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and legacy. The storm finally began to fade outside, but inside the mansion, another storm had just begun. The storm had broken by dawn, but inside Richard Hale's mansion, the air was heavier than ever. The child slept soundly in Clara's arms, the faintest trace of dawn touching his cheeks. Clara, exhausted but blissfully unaware, dozed beside him. Richard did not sleep. He sat rigid in a chair at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on the newborn. Every feature was a knife turning deeper into old scars. The resemblance wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Jonathan. His late brother. His shadow, his rival, his blood. The name whispered through Richard's mind like a curse. Memories of Jonathan. Jonathan had been everything Richard was not, charismatic, reckless, beloved by women. While Richard built his empire with cold precision, Jonathan lived fast and burned bright. Until the night he didn't. His sudden death in a car accident years ago had left Richard hollow with grief and relief. For Jonathan had always been a reminder of what Richard could never be, Warm, easy, loved without effort. And now here he was, alive again, in the fragile form of an infant. Richard's chest tightened. He rose abruptly, pacing the room, his footsteps sharp against the marble. Clara stirred. Clara's innocence. Richard. Her voice was groggy, still heavy with exhaustion. Is something wrong? He turned sharply, his jaw clenched. Wrong? Look at him, Clara. Look at his face. Clara blinked in confusion. She looked down at the sleeping child, her lips parting in a soft smile. His perfect. Perfect. Richard snapped. His tone made her flinch. Don't you see it? The eyes, the jaw, he looks exactly like Jonathan. The name struck Clara like lightning. Jonathan. My brother. Richard's voice was harsh, but beneath it quivered something raw. My dead brother. Clara's brows furrowed. She shook her head quickly. Richard, I don't understand. He stepped closer, his eyes burning. Don't lie to me. Did you know him? Did you? He broke off, unable to finish the thought. Her face drained of color, but not with guilt. With shock. The hidden past. I didn't know he was your brother, Clara whispered. Her hand trembled as she held the child closer to her chest, protective by instinct. Richard, years ago, before everything, before I lost everything, I met a man. His name was Jonathan. He never told me his last name. The words twisted in Richard's chest. Clara continued, her voice faltering as the memories surfaced. I was younger. Desperate. He was kind to me in a way I hadn't known in years. He helped me once, paid for my rent when I was on the edge of losing my home. We had a brief relationship. And then, suddenly, he vanished. No explanation. I thought he'd just grown bored of me. Her eyes filled with tears. I never knew he died. I never knew he was your brother. Richard's world tilted. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. Clara's downfall, her struggles, the man she had once clung to, it had been Jonathan. And now fate, cruel and twisted, had delivered her back into the Hale family's grasp. Richard's turmoil. Richard turned away, his hand pressed against his forehead. Betrayal burned in his veins, but not from Clara. She hadn't lied. She hadn't schemed. She had been as blind as he was. No, the betrayal came from the past. From Jonathan. Even in death, his brother was haunting him. Jonathan had touched Clara's life first, left his imprint on her heart, and now, perhaps, on her child. Was this baby Richard's heir, or Jonathan's legacy? Richard's chest heaved as he stared out the rain-streaked window. His empire, his careful plans, all his control, it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Behind him, Clara's voice broke the silence. Richard, please say something. The confrontation. He turned back, his expression torn between rage and wonder. Do you realize what this means? This child, he could be my brother's. Not mine. Do you understand what that does to everything? Clara's tears spilled freely. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. You think I would have agreed to this if I had known? You think I wanted this to be so twisted? Her honesty pierced him. There was no guile in her voice, no scheme in her eyes. Only fear, and love for the child in her arms. Richard's anger faltered, giving way to something heavier, grief. He sank into the chair again, his hands shaking. I thought I could buy an heir. Control my legacy. But what if fate has already written it differently? The child between them. The baby stirred then, a soft cry filling the tense silence. Clara gently rocked him, whispering soothing words. Richard watched, unable to look away. For all the torment, the questions, the shadows of Jonathan, there was no denying the truth before him. This child was alive. His blood, his family. A bond to Jonathan he had not asked for but could not ignore. Slowly, Richard reached out. Clara hesitated, then placed the baby in his arms. Richard held him awkwardly at first, his powerful hands trembling around the fragile bundle. The baby's blue eyes fluttered open, meeting his. Richard's breath caught. For the first time in years, tears welled in his eyes. Not for his empire. Not for his control, but for the ghost of a brother and the fragile life that tied them together. Acceptance or madness? Clara watched him, her expression cautious. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Richard's gaze never left the child. His voice was low, thick with conflict. "I don't know if his mine, or Jonathan's. But his Hale blood. That much is certain." He lifted his eyes to Clara's, the storm still raging within him. "This changes everything. My legacy. Our future. You. Me. Him." Clara swallowed hard, clutching the sheets. "Does it change how you see us?" Richard hesitated, his jaw tight. "I don't know yet." Outside, the first light of morning broke through the storm clouds, casting a pale glow over the three of them. It should have felt like hope, but for Richard, it was a dawn heavy with questions. The child had been born into a tangled web of love, betrayal, and destiny. And Richard Hale, for all his power, had never felt more powerless. The storm that had been brewing between Richard and Clara finally broke after the revelation of the child's uncanny resemblance to Richard's late brother. Though Richard was still reeling from the shock, his instinct was to retreat into the safety of control, the only language he had ever trusted. And control, for him, meant possession. In the days following the baby's birth, the atmosphere in Richard's mansion shifted from uneasy truce to a battlefield lined with invisible walls. Richard's lawyers were summoned quietly, and Clara overheard fragments of conversations, phrases like custody petition, legal guardianship, and unfit mother. The words cut into her deeper than she expected, because she had endured hardship before, but never the threat of losing the only light she had left, her child. Richard's claim. When Richard finally confronted her, his tone was colder than ice. "You agreed to bear this child. You were compensated, Clara. That was the arrangement. Don't confuse sentiment with contract." Clara held the baby close to her chest, her arms trembling but firm. "You think you can buy everything, Richard. But this isn't a house or a company. This is a child, my child. Money doesn't give you the right to rip him from me." Her words struck him harder than he admitted. For Richard, the child had started as a business necessity, a vessel for his legacy. But when he saw Clara's fire, her absolute unwillingness to let go, he felt something he hadn't in years, doubt. Yet pride pushed him forward. "You think you can provide for him?" Richard's voice grew harsher. "You lived on the streets, Clara. In shelters. How long before you collapse again? He needs stability, security, a name that opens doors. That's what I can give him." Clara's chin lifted defiantly. "I may have been homeless, but I've fought for every breath, every scrap of dignity. I've survived storms you can't imagine. What I can give him is love, Richard. Can you honestly say you know what that feels like?" The leak to the media. Before their battle could find resolution, the world intervened. Somehow, the story of Richard Hale paying a homeless woman to bear his child leaked to the press. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Tabloids ran with headlines like "Millionaire buys an heir," and from streets to nursery, the woman behind Hale's secret deal. Clara, once invisible, suddenly became the face of the scandal. Reporters camped outside the mansion, paparazzi hounded her every move, and the glare of cameras followed her to the hospital checkups. Yet to her own surprise, Clara did not crumble. Instead, she stood tall, clutching her child with quiet dignity. She refused interviews at first, but when pushed, she spoke with calm resolve. "I am not for sale. My child is not a commodity. I will protect him, no matter the cost." Her voice carried through the news, soft yet powerful, igniting sympathy from the public. Women who had once dismissed her began to see her as a symbol of resilience. The narrative shifted. Richard Hale, the untouchable millionaire, was painted as a man trying to buy control, while Clara emerged as the woman who refused to be silenced. Richard's humiliation. For Richard, the media storm was nothing short of humiliating. Business associates whispered behind closed doors, rivals laughed openly, and investors grew wary. His carefully constructed image of dominance and control crumbled under the weight of the scandal. But the worst humiliation was not in boardrooms or headlines, it was in the quiet moments when he saw Clara on television, her tired but unyielding eyes staring back at him as she said, "I will never abandon my child." The public, who had once adored his wealth and power, now applauded her courage. For the first time in his life, Richard Hale was no longer the protagonist of the story. Clara's resolve. Despite the chaos, Clara grew stronger. She no longer flinched when Richard raised his voice. She no longer worried about the shadows of his wealth or the threats of his lawyers. Instead, she focused on her child, on feeding him, rocking him to sleep, and whispering promises of a future where he would never know the kind of hunger she had once endured. Richard tried to intimidate her with documents, legal jargon, and cold declarations of authority. But Clara had changed. The woman who once slept in alleys now stood her ground in marble halls. She faced him not as the desperate homeless woman he thought he had bought, but as a mother armed with unshakable love. "You can take me to court," she told him one night, her voice steady. "You can throw all your money at lawyers. But understand this, Richard, no child deserves to grow up thinking they were a transaction. If you fight me, you don't just risk losing me, you risk losing him." A shift in power. Her words planted a seed in Richard, though he refused to show it. For years, he had believed power was measured in wealth, contracts, and control. But as he watched Clara cradle the baby, whispering softly while cameras outside begged for glimpses, he realized she held something far greater, moral authority. She had nothing once, and still she fought with a strength he couldn't replicate. The empire he built trembled because of one woman's refusal to bend. In those moments, Richard began to understand something that unsettled him more than any scandal. The future of his legacy, his family, and his name did not rest in his wealth, it rested in Clara's hands. The storm that had shaken Richard Hale's empire did not pass quickly. Days bled into weeks, and with every headline, every public opinion piece, the walls of his fortress of power cracked further. Yet what unsettled him most was not the media frenzy or the whispers in the boardrooms, it was the sight of Clara, steady and unbroken, holding their child with a calm resolve that mocked his obsession with control. For the first time in years, Richard began to question the very foundation of his beliefs. He had always told himself that children needed legacy, wealth, and security. But when he looked at the infant's tiny fingers curling around Clara's, when he saw the quiet way she soothed cries with nothing more than a whisper and a lullaby, he realized how little his millions meant in the face of something so simple, yet so profound, love. A fragile truce. Still, Richard's pride would not vanish overnight. He and Clara clashed often in the days following the scandal. Arguments erupted in hushed voices behind closed doors, about custody, about the child's future, about whether Clara could truly shield him from the harsh light of public scrutiny. "You think love is enough?" Richard demanded one evening, pacing the study like a caged animal. "The world isn't kind, Clara. That child will be scrutinized, followed, judged for who his father is. Without protection, he'll be eaten alive." Clara met his gaze, unwavering. "And what you call protection is really control. You don't want to shield him, Richard, you want to own him. That's not fatherhood. That's fear." The words stung because they were true. Slowly, painfully, Richard realized that Clara's strength wasn't naive, it was the very thing his world had been missing. And though their clashes were frequent, both understood that neither could truly win without breaking the very life they sought to protect. So a truce was forged, fragile as glass. They agreed to raise the child together, not in the suffocating shadow of Hale wealth, nor in the precarious uncertainty of Clara's past, but in a balance that demanded both of them learn to bend. Richard's public reckoning. The turning point came when Richard did what no one expected. At a press conference meant to soothe investors and silence tabloids, he stood behind the podium with cameras flashing, and for the first time, he spoke not as the untouchable tycoon, but as a man stripped of illusions. "The truth is," Richard began, his voice steadier than he felt, "this child was not born out of a contract, but out of circumstance that I thought I could control. I believed money could shape destiny. But I was wrong. What I have learned from Clara is that dignity and love cannot be bought. She has shown strength where I showed arrogance. And today, I acknowledge not just my child, but the woman who fought for him when I saw him only as an heir." Gasps rippled through the room. Investors shifted uncomfortably. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. For Richard Hale to publicly yield, to admit fault, was unthinkable. Yet in that moment, his confession did what money never could, it humanized him. Clara, watching from the side, felt a mix of disbelief and cautious respect. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. The fall of Madeline. Richard's admission came at a cost to others, most notably Madeline. Once his trusted confidant and the woman who had orchestrated much of Clara's suffering, she had lurked in the background, smugly certain that Richard would never sever ties with her. But in the wake of his public declaration, Richard turned to her with eyes that no longer carried trust. "You fed the press, didn't you?" he accused, the bitterness in his tone sharper than any courtroom judgment. Madeline faltered, but only for a second. "I did what was necessary to protect you. To protect us." "There is no us," Richard cut her off coldly. "You used me, and you tried to destroy the only person who had the courage to stand against me. You're finished, Madeline." Within days, she was cut off completely, her accounts frozen, her influence stripped. Society, which had once embraced her charm, turned its back as the truth of her schemes unraveled. For Madeline, the fall was swift and merciless. Clara's rebuilding. For Clara, the future no longer looked like survival, it looked like possibility. With the settlement she had demanded, she bought a modest but warm home away from the chaos of the mansion, a place where she could raise her child on her own terms. She refused to be dependent on Richard, though he offered countless times. Instead, she used the strength she had gained from years of hardship to carve out her own path. Small steps at first, an online shop, freelance work, community outreach with other mothers in need. Each step reminded her that she was no longer the woman sleeping in alleys, nor the silent pawn in someone else's plan. And though Richard remained present, sometimes visiting, sometimes awkwardly fumbling through fatherhood, he no longer tried to cage her. Instead, he watched as Clara grew into a woman of quiet influence, admired by strangers and respected by those who once sneered. Redemption. In time, the battles softened into uneasy peace. Richard still struggled with control, with his instinct to measure love in wealth. But every time he saw Clara smile at their child, every time the little boy reached for her first, Richard was reminded of the truth that had saved him from himself: legacy meant nothing without love. One evening, as Clara rocked the baby by the window, Richard approached quietly. His voice was low, almost humbled. "I used to think I was the one who saved you," he admitted. "But now I see, it was you who saved me." Clara didn't reply at once. She only looked at him, her expression unreadable, then turned back to the child. Yet in her silence, there was no anger, only acceptance. She no longer needed Richard's validation. She had her own power now, one that no fortune could touch. For Richard, that was redemption. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. But the chance to be part of something real, something he could not buy, manipulate, or control. And for Clara, redemption meant freedom, not as Richard's possession, not as a victim of the past, but as a mother whose strength had rewritten her fate. Months had passed since the storm of revelations, betrayals, and public reckonings. The mansion that once symbolized Clara's imprisonment now stood quiet, a place Richard visited but no longer dominated. Life had shifted. The chaos of scandal gave way to a new rhythm, one that Clara herself set. Clara had not wasted her newfound freedom. With the settlement and public sympathy, she launched something close to her heart, a foundation for homeless women and mothers in need. It was a cause born of her own suffering, nights spent without shelter, days spent starving while her unborn child grew inside her. Now, instead of those memories breaking her, they fueled her determination. The foundation began modestly, a rented office, a handful of volunteers, and Clara's relentless drive. But soon, with coverage from sympathetic media outlets and the quiet financial backing of Richard, it blossomed. Safe houses were established, job training programs initiated, counseling offered. Women who once believed they were invisible now had a place that called them by name. Clara was not just a figurehead. She was present, meeting with women personally, listening to their stories, offering advice with the gentleness of someone who had lived through their pain. She held their children, reassured their fears, and, most importantly, reminded them that they deserved dignity. For Richard, the foundation was humbling in ways his business empire had never been. At first, he had offered to fund everything lavishly, imagining buildings with his name etched in gold. But Clara refused the idea of it being branded as another Hale venture. "This isn't about your name," she told him firmly. "It's about theirs." To his surprise, Richard accepted the rebuke. Instead of controlling, he began learning to support quietly. He wrote checks without fanfare, appeared at events only when invited, and let Clara's leadership shine. For a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms, It was a lesson in humility. His relationship with the child changed as well. No longer did he speak of heirs, legacies, or the Hale bloodline. When he visited, he was simply Papa, awkwardly holding toys in two large hands, reading bedtime stories in a stiff voice that softened with each visit. Clara noticed the difference, how his pride was replaced by vulnerability, how the child's laughter was teaching Richard something stock markets never could. One afternoon, as the child toddled across the grass of Clara's modest garden, Richard sat beside her on the bench. There was no argument this time, no clash of wills, only a silence filled with unspoken understanding. "You've built something remarkable," Richard said, watching the child chase butterflies. His tone carried none of the arrogance it once held. Clara nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not about building empires, Richard. It's about building lives." He glanced at her, and for a fleeting moment, the man who had once tried to buy her existence seemed almost fragile. "I thought I was giving you everything when I offered wealth," he admitted. "But it turns out, you already had everything I didn't." Clara didn't respond immediately. She let the words linger, let their weight settle. For she no longer needed his validation. The life she had now was proof enough of her strength. As weeks turned into months, Clara found herself reflecting more often on the journey she had endured. She remembered the hunger, the humiliation, the way she had been dragged into a marriage built on contracts and lies. But she also remembered the transformation, the way she had found her voice, claimed her power, and carved her independence not from privilege, but from survival. The foundation became a symbol of that transformation. Each success story, a mother finding work, a child entering school, a family reunited, was a reminder that her suffering had not been in vain. Through her, countless others were finding second chances. And though Richard's presence remained complicated, she acknowledged that he, too, had changed. He no longer saw her as a possession, nor the child as a pawn. Slowly, he was becoming what he should have been all along, a father learning humanity through the very people he once overlooked. On the Foundation's first anniversary, Clara stood before a crowd of donors, volunteers, and women whose lives had been touched by her work. With her child in her arms, she addressed them with quiet confidence. "Once, I was told that my worth was a contract. That love could be bought, and dignity erased. But standing here, I know that isn't true. None of us are possessions. We are stories, we are survivors, and we are builders of futures. This foundation isn't mine, it belongs to every woman who refuses to be broken." Applause filled the room, but Clara felt no need to bask in it. Her satisfaction came not from praise, but from the sight of mothers smiling, children playing freely, women holding their heads high. Later that night, when the celebration ended, Richard approached her quietly. He carried the child on his shoulder, fast asleep. He didn't offer a speech, only a simple nod of respect, as if acknowledging not just her strength, but her victory. Clara smiled faintly, and for once, there was no bitterness, only peace. As she looked at her child, then at the Foundation's banner fluttering in the evening breeze, Clara whispered a truth she now fully embraced. She had come from despair, endured betrayal, and fought for survival. But in the end, she had built something greater than survival. She had built a legacy. And as for Richard, the man who once believed everything had a price, he had learned the greatest lesson of his life. The millionaire paid for a child, but what he received was a family that taught him humanity.